Good evening, everyone. I'm Kelly Gallatley, Director of the Ian Potter Museum of Art, the University's Art Museum. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we gather this evening and on which the University stands, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also extend that respect to any First Nations people who join us here this evening. As many of you know, and I'm sure we've got a number of Robin Boyd devotees here in the audience tonight, 2019 is the year in which the Robin Boyd Foundation is celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of Robin Boyd, one of Australia's most influential architects. The Robin Boyd Centenary of Design is a year-long series of events and exhibitions organised by the Robin Boyd Foundation in collaboration with an extensive group of partner institutions. And the Potter is absolutely thrilled to be part of this important celebration, which provides the opportunity to both foreground and reassess Robin Boyd's significant contribution. Tonight's lecture on Boyd's civic designs focuses on his career between 1960 and 1970, and particularly his involvement in two significant design expos, Expo 67 in Montreal in Canada and Expo 70 in Osaka in Japan. This fascinating period in the latter part of Boyd's career I think will really be illuminating for us here tonight, and I, like you, I think will greatly anticipate what our two eminent speakers, who I will introduce to you now, have to share with us this evening. So how this is going to work is our speakers will come up and speak together. They will then, they're just going to move on into Q&A for you, so there will be the opportunity to ask questions at the end of their talk. Our first speaker is Dr. Peter Raisbeck, who is an architect, design teacher and researcher, and teaches design activism and architectural practice at the Melbourne School of Design here at the University of Melbourne. Peter's work explores architectural intersections with media technologies, design activism and politics, and architectural history. And his PhD thesis had a focus, interestingly given what we're looking at tonight, on utopian cities of the 1960s. And if you haven't already subscribed to his popular blog, it's called Surviving the Design Studio. Our second speaker this evening is Dr. Christine Phillips, who is an architect and senior lecturer at RMIT's School of Architecture and Urban Design. Christine is also co-director of UPLA with Tanya Davidge, an organisation which aims to create positive public conversations around the built environment. And she's a member of the Heritage Council of Victoria. Her research interests include Australian architectural history and heritage, contemporary design and reconciliation within design. Could you please join with me in welcoming our speakers, Christine?
Thank you, Kelly, for that lovely welcome, and I do apologise in advance. I've got one of those terribly annoying spring sniffles. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for coming. As non-Indigenous architects, we would like to acknowledge that we're on the beautiful yet unceded lands of the Bunurong and the Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and we'd like to pay our respects to their elders past and present.
Thanks, Christine. This research is the result of over 10 years of us working together in the State Library's Grounds Romberg Boyd archive. This archive is probably one of the most significant archives of Australian architectural work from the 50s and 1960s. So we'd like to thank Lois McAvee from the SLV, who has given us invaluable assistance in the archive in recent times. We would also like to thank Harriet Edquist and Anna Carew at the RMIT Design Archive, they also have some material there as well. And most of the work here is based on a number of Sarhan's conference papers. Sarhan's is the Society of Architectural Historians of Australia and New Zealand that we've done over a number of years. And this work that we present to you tonight will be in our forthcoming book, which will look at Boyd's work and the trajectories of his practice from about 1960 to his untimely death. So today we'll be talking about Boyd's multimedia designs for Expo 67 and 70. And this is an aspect of work we feel needs more attention than it has currently got. Ooh, wrong one. Robin Boyd, as you will all know, was a polymath whose creative work reverberated across a range of platforms, from interiors, architecture, garden design, writing, illustration and public broadcasting. Whilst Boyd's use of traditional forms of media such as television broadcasts, newspaper columns and best-selling books are well known, lesser known is Boyd's explorations into the nexus between architectural space, sound theatre and the new media technologies of the 1960s. He saw these as a way to ignite people's imaginations. Boyd's flair with a range of multimedia design experiments are yet to receive much analysis, and we're hoping to give them a great deal of attention in our book.
So we will be talking about the Expo 67 in Montreal, Canada, where Boyd's wonderful sound chairs embedded pre-recorded tape recordings to create a sonic narrative of Australian identity.
And at Expo 70 in Osaka, Japan, Boyd's space tube design combined a range of media and spatial apparatus to create an immersive experience and depiction of Australian life.
Now, Boyd's extensive body of work, in our opinion, was very much underpinned by an interest in how architecture is experienced and how that experience can be designed and curated. Boyd was anti-object. He was anti the idea that buildings were sculptures to be looked at. He cared about the quality of the spaces within. And to quote from Boyd, he said that the quality of the space or spaces contained in a building is the art and the heart of architecture. Boyd thought hard about how people would inhabit the spaces, and he crafted the way people moved in and around the spaces, often navigating around nature through very clever circulation devices. And this created a wonderful synergy between the architecture and the people moving within that architecture. At Boyd's own Wall Street house from 1957, for example, as you can see here, a building that many of you have probably visited, there is no celebration of the form of the building from the street. In fact, it turns its back to the street with simply a red gate that entices you in.
And as many of you may know, as you walk through that red gate, there is a sense of ceremony. As you walk up the stairs to the front door, protected by the rain by a thin tent-like canvas that is lightly draped above you. And as you walk in, you are taken through a series of spaces, all focused around a central courtyard.
And then at the Featherston House from 1969, inspired by Boyd's Wall Street house, the clients Mary and Grant Featherston asked Boyd for an inside courtyard. Boyd not only met this request in a highly innovative manner, as you can see here, but also designed a unique way in which the clients were directed around this inside courtyard via a series of rather delightful platforms. So this interest in the curated experience reached a new peak within Boyd's Expo designs through the addition of multimedia. Boyd's Expo 67 and Expo 70 designs were like a total work of art, or a Gesamtkunstwerk, as we would say in German. It was Boyd's mentor, Walter Gropius, who tested the total work of art within architecture through his design of this building, the Bauhaus School, where the building and everything within it was designed as a complete entity. Boyd, however, remained closer to the original Wagnerian concept of the total work of art, with his inclusion of light and media shows first tested at his Expo 67 design and then further developed at his Expo 70 design. Richard Wagner presented the concept of Gesamtkunstwerk, or total artwork, in 1849 through his very highly influential essay called The Artwork of the Future. In it, Wagner spoke of a synthesizing or a totalizing of all of the arts to incorporate a full sensory experience. So this interest in the curated experience reached a new peak within Boyd's Expo designs through the addition of multimedia. He was very much like a film director. He designed and choreographed sequences of experiences that we will show you, heightened by an incorporation of sound and light shows.
While it was the Commonwealth Department of Works architect James McCormick who was commissioned to design the Australian Pavilion at Expo 67 in Montreal, Boyd's commission to design the exhibit fit-out should not be underestimated. This commission arrived at a time when Boyd was struggling to make ends meet in the office. The Expo 67 was thus a significant commission and included, quote, the complete design, integration, oversight and control of all exhibit material and all necessary liaison with the Commonwealth Department of Works.
And as the Prime Minister of Australia at the time, Harold Holt, remarked, quote, it would be the first time that the achievements of Australian designers and architects would be displayed in open competition with those of the rest of the world. And here, of course, we see Holt looking at that model of the Expo design, along with Boyd on the right and McCormick. So Boyd drew on a great range of media and display types that provided visitors to the Expo with an abundance of sensorial experiences. And these were all centred around the Australian adventure, a theme devised by an advisory committee. The exhibits and displays included maps, diagrams, cartoons, Aboriginal bark paintings, colour transparencies, very high tech, black and white photographs, and a very fine central trumpet-formed sculptural feature designed by Boyd. And a series of outdoor and landscaped areas extended from the ground floor, from the front of the pavilion to the rear, and undercroft areas where there were 3 mushroom form units accommodated services, along with a double height entry space encircled by a ramp. Native flora such as kangaroo paw grasses, eucalypts, ferns, along with an artificial billabong, were dispersed throughout the space, offering a textural and aromatic experience of the Australian bush. So here we see one of the display stands, and all of the display stands were constructed from plywood with this fiberglass overlay, and here we see the display for the Parkes radio telescope, and Boyd was very much a lover of new technologies. He described this assemblage as a kind of microcosm of Australia. He said, when you walk through the doors of this pavilion, you enter Australia. It's a kind of instant microfilm of what is actually happening and the life going on at this moment on the other side of the globe, 10,000 miles away from Montreal. Now, visitors entering the Australian Pavilion from the ground floor would be welcomed by these lovely ladies, 21 hostesses, dressed in bright orange sleeveless A-line dresses made from Australian wool, of course, with matching hip-length double-breasted jackets. And then they were directed up this circular ramp that you can see here, where they would pass by a series of ascending trumpet-shaped structures that you can see there in that slide, all designed by Boyd, displaying a range of image-based exhibits reflecting the theme of the Australian adventure. The images were presented on transparencies lit by different coloured fluorescent tubes, also very high-tech for the time. So it was at the top of the ramp where visitors were led to the main exhibition area, a huge, elegant salon, as Boyd described it. White woolen carpet clad with floors and walls, white curtains draped over the north and south glazed walls, and a white asbestos-sprayed ceiling, very popular at the time, served as a backdrop to highlight the exhibits within. And curated within the broader Australian adventure theme, the exhibits were grouped under the themes of arts, way of life, sciences, and national development, and displayed on low circular units and on the walls. Pardon me. Under Boyd's commission, well-known Australian designers Grant and Mary Featherston designed these lovely chairs that were manufactured by Aristoc. The chairs were upholstered in an Australian black wool fabric with orange cushions added into the chairs that delivered conversations in French. 250 sound chairs were dispersed across the salon floor, as you can see here, adding a dynamic sonic layer to Boyd's exhibition design. Each chair was fitted out with built-in stereophonic sound systems and an automatic switch that was activated when visitors sat in the chairs, triggering the tape recordings to present the visitors with a description of the visual display in forms in which they were seated. And here we see some of the technicians editing the audio for those sound chairs. And as a journalist from the Age newspaper provocatively reported at the time, were these sound chairs offering visitors a psychedelic experience? A drug happening? Not at all. Actually, the sound chairs were a very comprehensive exercise in interior design, industrial design, manufacturing, and sound media. So Boyd's idea was to provide visitors with an audio experience of Australian culture where visitors could listen to conversations from notable Australians on topics relating to the exhibition themes. And here we see the tape cartridge schedule.
And you may not be able to see this, but some of the people who were recorded included the former Prime Minister at that time, Sir Robert Menzies, as well as the then Prime Minister, Harold Holt, Sir Bernard Hines, the actress, Miss Googie Withers, the notable ballet performer, Sir Robert, I think then he was Mr. Robert Helpman, and someone whose name that we cannot mention, you may be able to read that, Sir Macfarlane Burnett, John Overall, who was the head of the National Capital Development Commission. Of course, there needed to be some sportsmen. Harry Hopman, I think, was the tennis player, and an author, Mr. Morris West.
Now, Boyd also played a major role in the content of the sound media. He worked very closely with George Farwell on this, who was a prominent author and publicity officer for the Expo, and together they shaped and directed the scripts for the sound chairs. While Farwell produced the initial scripts for the chairs, Boyd heavily edited the scripts, as you can see here, and forwarded them back to Farwell for the recordings. The scripts marked up by Boyd reveal how the pair together sought to shape a national identity and how Boyd was as concerned with the content as he was with the sonic effect of the exhibit. And in a letter Boyd later wrote to Sir Volston Hancock from the 16th of August 1966, Boyd requested additional conversations such as on the Australian language, democratic tradition, and of course the Aussie rules football to bring the conversations up to 30. So he was very much a key player in the content. Boyd wanted to offer, quote, a restful, welcoming, comfort, a haven of tranquility away from the bustle of the fair. Fairgoers, he said, should advise their friends, when tired, go to the Australian Pavilion. Yet while they rest, we will tell them of the Australian adventure. And you can imagine the effect was very powerful. This wonderful field of visitors silently tuned into the audio exhibits within the most luxurious and civilised salon at Expo 67. So the sound chairs within the Australian Pavilion were very unique in comparison to the other kinds of exhibits that were at Expo 67, and most of these incorporated film projection technology. It was estimated that around 68% of the displays within Expo 67 utilised audio-visual aids to attract the attention of the public to the theme of the World Fair, and most of these were conventional film projections. So, as you can imagine, with a focus on the oral rather than the visual, the sound chairs thus offered a very distinctive experience at Expo 67 and were enormously successful. As reported in the Age newspaper at the time, the chairs are the Australian Pavilion and have been sufficient to attract many more thousands of visitors to the pavilion than were expected. And in fact, over 1 million visitors attended the Australian Pavilion that year, and the success of Boyd's exhibit design far surmounted the committee's expectations.
This is Expo 70. So while the use of mixed media proliferated in the Expo 67 exhibits, it was at Expo 70 in Osaka, Japan, where the use of media technologies reached a new zenith. This was particularly so with Boyd's design of the exhibits within a space tube for the Australian Pavilion. Here at Osaka, the architectural experiments of the 60s were broadcast to an international audience. And this was probably because of the influence of the Japanese metabolist architects who were directly involved with the planning of many of the exhibits at Expo 70. James McCormick, the government architect, was again commissioned to design the Australian Pavilion. This time it turned out being not a sort of box, but an odd coat hanger looking structure. Boyd was to complete the exhibition design within the theme of the Australian contribution to progress and harmony for mankind, a theme which was in accord with and complementary to the overall Expo theme. As Boyd was quoted on saying on HSV7's, for those of you who don't know, that was a television station, Meet the Press television program, he stated that expositions were important because they also showed that a country was contributing something other than merely feeding itself. The compelling feature of Boyd's Expo design was his design of a space tube, a tubular form sprayed with gunite, a cement and concrete, a cement and sand mixture, and the tube was fitted with, inside it, with travellators, and this was placed along McCormick's pavilion. It was Boyd's inventiveness and experimentation which once again brought the exhibits to life in a dazzling experiential way, marking a shift to sensibility from the contemplative mode of the sound chairs to a much more dynamic, interactive mode within the space tube. And I think it must have been great and a great delight for Boyd to present and design something like this in Japan, given his own passion for Japanese architecture and following the publication of his books, Kenzo Tange in 1962 and New Directions in Japanese Architecture in 1968. In consultation with the Commonwealth Government Committee, Boyd proposed 4 sub-themes for the exhibits within the space tube. These were, I'm afraid to say, man, man and nature, man and the man-made, and, of course, man and man. Interestingly, I should say that the man and mankind narrative is pretty much a predominant feature of 1960s architectural discourse. In the space tube, each of these themes were allocated 5 bays, and thus there were 20 bays of the space tube, and it was within each of these bays there were a number of individual display boxes, which I will show you. Each bay was about 10 feet long, making the entire tube about 200 feet long. The space tube was constructed so that in each of these 20 bays, up to 4 display boxes could be deployed. Each of these display boxes would tell a story about a particular topic. And so, to reiterate, the exhibits were thus distributed thematically along the tube in 4 segments with 20 bays, with each bay comprising of up to 4 display boxes arranged radially around the tube, as you can see in this original sketch. Here is a model of the space tube sitting in its sunken garden beside McCormick's Pavilion. Like his design for Expo 67 and the exhibits there, Boyd skillfully composed the experience of the visitors from the moment they entered the pavilion to the moment they departed. On the left is a circulation diagram describing how one would move through the tube and McCormick's Pavilion, and the right is a pamphlet from the Expo. Whilst waiting to gain entry into the space tube, visitors could watch films involving sound and a variety of optical effects projected onto what was called a cycloramic screen, a full circle screen around the queuing area, and this was situated under McCormick's coat hanger. The space tube, as I mentioned a bit ago, was fitted with 2 travellators or moving walkways that controlled the movement and the flow of the visitors. Once entering the spacesuit tube, visitors were led through a sequence of immersive multimedia experiences, a clever orchestration devised by Boyd where they would encounter each exhibit as a sequence, as he said, as an unfolding story of Australia. The display boxes for the exhibits were all made in Australia and simply bolted on and then plugged into power when they got to Japan. This is a picture of a completed display box being prepared for shipment to Japan. This, I think, is display box number 19A, which had a polar coat screen on which films were to be projected. And inside it, there were internal film projectors that also needed to be accessible. So I guess you can see from the scale of this particular image that it was a pretty logistically tricky exercise, as well as quite a complicated media exercise. Like a mad alchemist, Boyd incorporated several novel multimedia systems which were interdependent with the visitor, and he was responsible for the design and production of all the film, visual sequences and sound effects within the tube. Rather than position the visitor as a passive entity who views exhibits, Boyd designed the exhibits in a way so that the visitor had a distinct curatorial experience. This is a sketch of Boyd's which would become part of Display 2, which describes McFarlane Burnett's contribution to organ transplants. Boyd, in this sketch, also personally selected the images for the films and looked at the way that the film sequences and the displays from the projectors would be mounted at different angles to create different effects. Thus, the aim in the space tube was to capture the eye and ear with light and colour and with music and sounds. And all of this was created with 28 film movie projectors, 46 synchronised slide projectors and hundreds of fluorescent tubes, and in the specification we noted about 2,000 incandescent lamps. These were overlaid with sound effects, synchronised to visual cues, the result of a collaboration in part between Boyd and the Australian composer George Dreyfus. Of note was the integration of what Boyd called technomation effects, which was achieved by projecting from multiple lights or projectors light onto coloured plastic screens, creating an almost psychedelic experience for visitors in some of the displays. As the viewer moved past the display, as Boyd said, the screen would shimmer and ripple with colour and light. This is Exhibit 6A. Of course, we needed to show what we could do in Australia, like we could actually make atomic spectroscopes. Not sure if we can do that now. And at the press briefing, you can see the Exhibit 6A, the atomic spectroscope, and this press briefing was prior to the display boxes going to Japan in, I think, about June 69. It might have been a bit later. This is from display 2A, the immunology display, and of course it's a giant brain. This is an early sketch of Boyd's for Exhibit 2C, which was simply described as the viruses. And this is the viruses in their actual circular display box. And interestingly, I think Boyd was to write in the specification, and I'm of the opinion that he did write the specifications for these projects, particularly this one, because of the elegant prose in it. He said that the effect required was for the bacteria needed to circulate erratically inside the black painted container. All of these things were to be illuminated by internal globes and mounted on what he described as spring steel for a floating effect. Exciting stuff, but not as exciting as this. This was display 13C in this transport section, and this is Jack Brabham's car, who was a personal hero of mine when I was 5 years old in the mid-60s, and for those of you who may not know, was an Australian racing driver who was Formula One world champion in 59, 1960 and 66. He was the founder of the Brabham racing team that bore his name. This was a transparent plastic model, and indeed we think that it was also constructed by Brabham or his company Repco Brabham themselves. And the entire ensemble was set against a projected film of the car racing along a Formula One racecourse. There was another transformative multimedia display within Boyd's Expo 70 design, and this was the amazing Exhibit 20. This was a collaboration between Boyd and the experimental Australian multimedia artist, and I hope I can pronounce his name correctly, Stan Ostoja-Kotkowski. Exhibit 20 showcased a three-dimensional abstract pattern. It was the final exhibit in the tube, and it used lasers, I think it used lasers, 1,000 lamps on an 8-foot diameter sphere. It was preceded by display 19, which was the big box I previously showed, which were 5 movie screens showing Australian film successes of the past. But this display, and this is Ostoja-Kotkowski's sketch of it, incorporated over 1,500 globes operating 2 systems, one a colour spectrum system forming background shapes, the other a white light system forming designs and figures, which was intended to create an alluring effect for the visitor.
And we weren't able to locate a photo of Exhibit 20, so if anyone has found one, let us know. Now, in the early part of the decade, very well-known British architect Cedric Price had claimed, "We just haven't learned how to enjoy our new freedom, how to turn machinery, robots, computers and buildings themselves into instruments of pleasure and enjoyment." Now, Peter and I argue that only a few years later at both Expo 67 and Expo 70 did we see Price's call realised in many of the pavilions that were presented as kinds of sensory techno machines. And Boyd's Expo designs were no exception within this climate, and certainly gave him the platform to experiment with his interest in the nexus between the body, space and media, tested on an international audience and broadcast across many different media platforms. Successfully achieving a total work of art, he was very much scathing of Frei Otto's tensile structured West German pavilion that you can see there on the left, along with the geodesic dome of Buckminster Fuller's United States America Pavilion at Expo 67. And I have to say I'm quite fond of both of those pavilions. But nevertheless, Boyd said, "But what will be inside these monstrous fragments of utopia? An expo should be more than an experimental architecture and exterior effects." Boyd's comprehensive design and curation at both these expo designs signal him as a champion of new technologies and media. Thank you very much. We'd like to open up for some discussion if any of you have any questions.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, the budgets. Yeah, you probably know more.
I was
about
just
the
wondering
budgets
if, in your research, if you came across what the budget was for either of the pavilions.
Yes, we have. The budgets are quite, for both of these projects, the budgets were quite generous. I think they were in the order, I can't remember exactly, but they were probably in the order of hundreds of thousands of pounds. I think Expo 70 was around about £300,000. I've seen a list of all the display boxes with the prices next to each of them.
And Boyd got a pretty good fee for his designs as well.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
They were important commissions for him at that time.
All off to the pub then?
There's one.
I was just wondering, both Boyd's like Space Tube and similar projects at the time, like the Carnegie Towers, are so obviously metabolist in their influence. What kind of personal relationship did Boyd have with the metabolists at this time?
That's a good question. I won't pick a bone with you about whether or not they're metabolist. He was certainly influenced by the metabolists. I think when he went to Japan in the first case to write the book on Tange, it was a total revelation to him. And I think he had a strong relationship to Kenzo Tange, and certainly in the course of writing that book and the second book, he came across quite a few and would have been in contact with some of those metabolists. But I think for me the interesting thing is those metabolists at the beginning of the 1960s, they were very much young Japanese architects. They were young men, Isozaki, Kikutake, and I think even Kurokawa. But by the end, by 1970, they had, and I think because of Japanese industrialisation and urbanisation, they had done huge projects. Like they had really done huge projects. And much bigger commissions than anything Boyd may have ever had. So I think that's probably an interesting context to put it into.
And interestingly, Norman Day, who worked for Boyd during these later years, wrote a paper on the connection between Neptune's fishbowl and the, what was that pavilion at Expo 70?
The Ricoh
Japanese, the
Pavilion.
Ricoh Pavilion. and there's a pretty direct visual connection between that and the fishbowl design as well. So,
Yeah, often I think the fishbowl is seen as being a Buckminster Fuller thing or a Metabolist thing or some crazy postmodern thing. But when you look at the Rico Pavilion at Expo 70, you can see where the idea came from.
and yeah, Norman talks about it being a very singular idea rather than the pluralist postmodernist thing, and I think he's probably right about that. I have to agree with that.
Yep.
I just wanted to ask a very simple question, which is, what happened to the chairs after the expo? Are they actually still in existence?
That's a good question.
I think I've seen one. There was an exhibition curated by Philip Goad and Alan Pert last year, and they managed to get one chair. It may have been the prototype chair, and I think that still exists somewhere. Unfortunately, the space tube was basically completely dismantled in Japan and thrown into a pit. So there's really nothing left of that. So, and I imagine the same fate would have fallen the 67 box.
Yeah. I also wonder about all the other exhibits, like the Aboriginal bark paintings and all the rest of the stuff.
I think certainly for 67, where they did get in a lot of actual, material things like paintings. There were Indigenous paintings by, people who were in Boyd's particular circle and that sort of thing, photographs and that sort of thing. I imagine that some of those things still exist because many of them were actually on loan. But I suspect that most of the material in the Osaka space tube is gone because it was kind of like a lot of it was a simulation of different things.
Well, if you could please join me in thanking Christine and Peter. Watch out for their book before Christmas. And thank you so much for being part of the Potters Inside Out program, for your patience in finding this theatre. We are in a period of rejuvenation ourselves, so we don't reopen until September next year, but please stay connected with us and our programs and find us in different spaces around campus and out and about. But if you join me in thanking Peter and Christine.